Welcome to the inaugural event of the Peace Talk Policy and Research. This event was focused on Myanmar, on this very intricate conflict. And you'll see the full recording of this event in this video, with the discussion and experts from academia, but as well from the policy world, shedding light on this very complicated situation happening right now in Myanmar. This new series of events, called Peace Talks Policy and Research, is an initiative by Professor Massimo Morelli, Professor Dominic Rohner, and myself. We really aim to create more synergies, exchange between academia, the policy world, field experts, to make scientific research more useful to the world, more realistic, to connect with people working on those situations concretely. And we think that also the policy world will benefit from those exchanges by knowing and having access to the latest results of cutting-edge scientific research.
Welcome everybody. This is the first event of the Peace Talks series that Content Gallia, Dominic Rohner and myself have decided to organize to bring together in every event an academic and a policymaker, broadly defined, to discuss important topics that relate to democratization, or in any case, how to go about important salient issues of these days that involve conflict and therefore peace, what our objective is, which is peace and conflict resolution and reconciliation later on in later talks. So I will soon give the floor to Dominic to present the speakers of today. Let me just take the occasion to thank Michela Pozzi and Bocconi, who helped us organize this first event, which is always the most time-consuming, and thanking all the other institutions that have helped us in this matter, from beside Bocconi, Lausanne, Zurich, and also thanking the participation for the email distribution of CPR and the various RPNs. Dominic, do you want to go ahead with the introduction of the speakers?
Yes, thanks a lot again, Michela. Thanks so much for all the work. And thanks a lot for Patrick Francois and Björn Gehrmann to accept to be part of us today. So Patrick Francois is a professor of economics at UBC, chair of the department, famous development economist, very well published, very well cited, fellow of various institutions like CFAR, CPR, BRED, president of SRED, editorial duties at various journals like JD, Journal of Development Economics, AER, etc. Björn Gehrmann is a career diplomat from Germany. He's a very rare person who at the same time is an academic holding a PhD in economics and has all the training of diplomacy, also in mediation. And so he's kind of navigating with much success both worlds, the world of diplomacy and world of academia. And so we're very happy to have this illustrious team today among us, and let's move forward without further delay. Okay, thanks so much. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I know I'm muted. I'm just getting my slides, and just bear with me. And I hope everyone can see those slides. Okay.
I mean, just one word to say to everybody. So we are recorded. So that's something important to bear in mind. So if you don't want to see your picture on our YouTube channel, please switch off your camera. So yeah, just to be aware that we're recorded. Okay, the floor is yours, Patrick.
Thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction. Thanks for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is a great idea. These discussions between academics and policymakers. I'd love to be involved in future. I'm proud to be doing the inaugural one. So thank you again. Okay, so let me first say that this is very much academic work, as Dominic indicated, and it is joint work with Jim Fearon, who's a very famous political scientist at Stanford University, and for whom I'm greatly indebted. Okay, so how did this work start, and what is it about? This work started by our interest in the developments in Myanmar, starting around 2010, but really culminating 2015. We started working on this, and we were motivated by the question, which is, what on earth was this all-powerful military dictatorship doing by heading down a path to democratization? Was it a legitimate path? What was the end game? What were the set of possible things that could happen? That was our motivation in 2015. So when we started researching it, we realized that actually this path to democracy that really started, you could sort of date it in many different ways, but at least the constitutional part of it started in 2008, was a rather typical elite-led or top-down democratic transition. And by a top-down democratic transition, I mean a transition that's governed by an autocratic constitution, a constitution that was written by the preceding autocratic leadership. Okay, so these have been well studied. So there are two authors in particular, Albertus and Menaldo, that have documented a large number of these. In fact, if you consider the democratic transition since 1945, since the Second World War, almost half of them fit this pattern, and fit a pattern that's very similar to what we observed in Myanmar. And there are particular things that tend to happen in these. Okay, so here are the examples. I mean, I'm not going to talk about these examples in any detail. I'm really going to focus on Myanmar, but these are just ones that you might want to have in mind. You can see a pattern there, which is that tends to generally be the case that militaries and single party rule autocracies choose these transitions with autocratic constitutions. They're rarely chosen. They're rarely chosen by personalist dictators. There seems to also be a difference if you just look at the raw data in terms of outcomes. So leaders that manage to transition via an autocratic constitution generally do better in terms of avoiding these pretty bad outcomes than the ones who don't. This is not causal evidence in any sense, but it's just a pattern that we observed. And this is the other pattern that I referred to before, that it tends to be the military and single party dictatorships that choose these. But we're talking about small numbers here. So again, don't put too much on this, but there are some patterns. And part of the work we've done here is to try to explain these patterns, which is a little bit beyond what I want to talk about today. I want to focus just on Myanmar. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to really develop a conceptual framework to think through the following issues. So here are the issues and the questions that motivated us, and the kind of a hint at the answers that we're going to give here. So the first question was, why did the Tamil follow this path in the first place? And we're going to argue that there are gains and some risks from democratization, and that they have to do with certain political economy considerations. I'm not going to talk too much about their reliance on China and wanting them to reduce that diplomatically. There were certainly benefits from the international community and some threats, but not great ones for them. What is the key factor that generally impedes the democratization path? So once an autocracy enters onto this path, why don't they all choose it? And what are the problems that they face? And we're going to argue here that there's one very important commitment problem that's difficult to solve. And it's the solving of this problem that's key to determining whether an autocracy goes down the path. So what this will give us is a set of conditions under which this path is chosen by autocrats, and they've got to do with the role of the international community, the salience of both internal and external threats to the autocratic regime, and the capacity for the autocratic regime to re-threaten for power once they're deposed, so once they leave the state house. And this is going to be a key variable that we're going to identify and we're going to talk about in the case of Myanmar. If I get a little bit of time, I'll talk about why institutionalists and personalist dictatorships tend to choose these paths differentially, but I don't know if I'll get much time for that. Okay. Then I'm going to talk about the outcomes along this path. There are two really starkly different outcomes that are possible. One is true democratic consolidation, which takes time typically along these paths. And another one is basically a reversion back to autocracy. So that's maybe quite obvious. Yes. Okay, so what is less obvious, I think, is what factors determine which path you end up on. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the role of sanctions. And this is going to be a key variable that's going to play an important role. I'm going to call it P, just for shorthand, and this is the only notation in this paper. And what I mean by P is that thing I was talking about in the previous slide, i.e., the capacity for the previous autocrat to re-threaten for power once they've left office. Okay, so I'm going to argue that the way that this evolves through time is key to determining whether we end up in this true democratic consolidation or whether we end up in this. And there are different examples of how it has evolved that have led to different outcomes. So if it's slow, if this decline in power, their capacity to re-threaten for power is slow, then we tend to get eventually successful democratic transition. If it's fast, but it's done in a way that surprises the military, then we will also get the military being, in a sense, neutered and out of power and unable to come back to power. If it's fast but anticipated, then we have problems. So what could have been done differently is something that we'll talk a little bit about. What could have been done differently to avoid the military returning to power in the case of Myanmar? And I think this is where we do get some policy ideas. And I'm going to be a little bit more speculative and talk about what the future holds. I think there are a few things that are possible. I think some amongst the possible things, there are some that are much more likely than others. And I think there are some things that are just simply impossible. In particular, point 3. I'm going to tell you why I think that's impossible. Okay, so here's part of the reward to democratization. Here's why autocrats might want to do it. Certainly in the case of Myanmar, this was seen dramatically. So the two graphs that you see here, the one on the left is official development assistance, and the one on the right is foreign direct investment. Both of these increased massively when it became clear, or when it became conjectured, that the military regime, the Temado, was serious about a type of democracy in Myanmar. And this is not an unusual pattern. If you look at there's lots of different ways to code this, but generally, if you look at the effect of democratizing, so this is a regression where we have as the dependent variable assistance per capita. So this is official development assistance per person flowing into a country as a function of what that country is being rated in terms of their democracy. So this is, somewhat controversial. There's lots of different ways of rating this, but one simple way to do it, and like I say, it doesn't really matter how you do it, is to use this polity variable. But what this figure shows us is that if you take all the countries in the world, there is a big and statistically significant effect of crossing a threshold in your democratization ranking or rating. It has a big positive effect on official development assistance. And it's the similar sizes, sometimes bigger if you break it down by regions, always the same direction, not always significant. And this is partly to do with, as you break it down by regions, you lose a number of observations and it gets much harder to say anything about it. But certainly it's true as a correlation across the world. Okay, so that's the benefit. So when an all-powerful autocracy contemplates heading down a democratic path, what's the key impediment to doing it? Well, here's the key impediment. This is what we're going to call the main commitment problem. It's simply that how are they going to ensure that they're going to get the share of benefits that are going to be created by this democratization once they've left power? Okay. So that their current opponents typically are people who have been brutalized by them. They're going to then come to power, and any commitment that that opponent gives that, of course, we will share the benefits with you is really a very pale commitment, one that would be very hard to enforce. So the usual answer, and the one that we might have implicitly in our mind, is, well, as long as the previous autocracy can threaten a coup to come back to power, then that's how they will enforce it. Someone will make a promise to them that they will get the benefits, the pie will increase, we will share the benefits with you. And if they don't, then the autocrat, at least at the start, is very powerful. They've just simply packed up, left the State House and gone to the barracks. They can always come back. Okay. So we're going to argue that that's not a good answer. Okay. So why is that? Well, very simply, it's because that threat can only take you back to where you were before the democratization. So all it can do is ensure for you payoffs that are like what you were getting before. So that means what? That means that the new incumbents, the new people holding the keys to the state, don't have to offer you any more than that. Right? They can't, it's impossible for you to use this threat to ensure a share of the expanded pie. Okay, so another answer that's posited in the political science literature, and it has been studied before, is, well, what the autocrats do is they write down a constitution. Okay, and if they can write it down in a clever enough way, it will ensure for them benefits. Okay, and this is certainly the answer that's implicit in these other authors that I talked about that have studied these things. Okay, so again, we're going to argue that's no answer. Okay, now why is that no answer? Well, because a piece of paper doesn't have much power. Okay, so why can't the new opposition simply say, well, this constitution, which gives the military, the ex-military, the ex-autocrats all this power, why should we be beholden to that? We've just won in a landslide. This was written by these people who were, our oppressive leaders for a number of years. It has no legitimacy. We can just rip it up. And if not ripping it up, why can't they just simply undermine it in subtle ways and maybe not so subtle ways? Now, exactly that happened in Myanmar. Right? That's exactly what Aung San Suu Kyi did when she came to power. The 2008 constitution prohibits her, was expressly written to prohibit her from being the prime minister, okay, or the president. She can't hold the paramount position of authority in the country. So she developed a workaround, which is the position of state councillor, which she has held up until recently, which made her de facto the most powerful person in the country. This is a clear violation of the 2008 constitution. There's no way to interpret it in any other way. Why did the military put up with it? Well, that's a good question. Why did they put up with it? I'll talk about that a little bit. But it's clear that simply writing things down on a piece of paper is not going to be enough either. So how do the elite solve this problem? How they solve it is that they actually change the whole democratization process. It's actually not really democratization. It's just power sharing. And this is what we saw in Myanmar. The opposition commitment problem was solved by the military retaining control, direct control of a set of major rent streams and a set of policies. Okay. So the opposition, Aung San Suu Kyi, she could pass any laws she wanted. She controlled the parliament, but those laws simply had no effect over the areas that the military directly controlled. Okay. Now, if she wanted to have effects over them, she would have had to start a fight with them. So what this did is it shifts the onus of the escalation onto the NLD, or the opposition, or Aung San Suu Kyi. And this reduces the ability of her to push the Tamadaw down to their coup reservation value. So that coup reservation is still playing an important role, but it's not what's binding how much they earn, because they can't be pushed down to that. Why? She simply doesn't have the levers to do it. So this solves part of the problem. What it does is it creates a stream of benefits that are hard for the previous opposition to expropriate, even once they get the keys to the State House. But it creates another problem. So heading down this democratization path creates the problem of legitimizing and empowering the opposition. And this is exactly what happened in the case of Myanmar. The Tamadaw moves from being the only real viable functional institution in the country for many years into the position of being the army. She holds the State House, and now the opposition, the previous opposition, in many cases which is outlawed, now becomes a legitimate political force. Okay, so we're going to argue that this does only one thing to this important variable. And this important variable is the military's capability to reseize control after a transition. We're going to argue this can only head in one direction once the military heads down a power sharing transition path. And that is downwards, this arrow. It can only go down. So there's three reasons. The first is that the ability of the outgoing elite to both organize and implement a successful coup falls through time. Their control over the economy, over the state, it diminishes. The second is that the longer the old elite are out of offices, the greater the ability for the new incumbents to simply organize their own resistance. Now, while I think both of these factors are true, I don't think that we've had that much time in the case of Myanmar to see great changes in these. I think the military is still very cohesive, and I don't see much capacity, direct capacity, for resisting the encroachment of the military. But I think even in the case of Myanmar, and even after such a short period, point 3 is strongly relevant. Okay, the more time after transition that the military is out of power, the greater the popular sentiment that a return to dictatorship is illegitimate and unacceptable. And this does a lot of things, right? This facilitates mass coordination. Possibly it can facilitate foreign support, and it can also lead to fissures within the military. So conflicting factions within the military that can undermine their authority. So this is a much harder thing to get a handle on, right? Because here we're talking about changes in people's minds, but we think this is important and significant. The fact that people no longer see the military as the only legitimate or even a remotely legitimate holder of national power and national authority is an important motivator for them getting into the streets and resisting the military. We think there's strong signs of this in Myanmar, and they're playing out right now today. Okay, so in our analysis, we're going to argue that a path to democratization can be successfully plotted under this elite-led transition. But it has to balance these two considerations. So on the one hand, the elite are trying to engineer a mechanism to make sure that they can ensure enough of the gains that will accrue upon democratization will flow to them. On the other hand, they have to manage, everyone, all sides, have to manage the decline in the previous autocrat's power. Even a partial democratization is going to let that happen. It's going to force that to happen, and that has to be managed. Okay, so when we look at this a little bit more carefully, we tend to get a set of possible paths that occur. Okay, so firstly, we find that these top-down transitions are generally better for almost everyone than bottom-up transitions, revolutions. And the big thing that they avoid is they avoid much of the costs and the risks from large-scale violence. Okay, and for the most part, they are much less violent than revolutions. But there is a price to pay. They come at a cost. And that is that democratization is only partial for a long while. Okay? The elites and the previous autocrats continue to draw rents from the state, at least for some time. Democracy can eventually consolidate along this path. And that means what? That if there's an autocratic constitution, that will eventually be revised, but there are risks to this happening. And we're seeing some of those risks playing out in the case of Myanmar now. Foreign aid has an important role here. So it has an important role in making these sorts of top-down transitions, these elite-led transitions, much more feasible and likely. Okay. Foreign aid has no such effect on bottom-up transitions. And an extension of the model, which I won't get time to talk about, we'll talk about why different sorts of dictators do this, but I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, so let me just jump to the case of Myanmar and say, I'm going to give a very, very brief history of how we got to 2015, and then kind of walk through what happened and is happening in light of our model. Okay. So starting around 1990, the Tamandao embarks on a roadmap to a constitution. So why 1990? We can talk about that, but at least, this discussion started a long time ago. And these discussions were between, at different times, the Tamandao, Aung San Suu Kyi, representatives of some of the ethnic armed organizations, other elements of civil society. And this was an ongoing and long-term dialogue. And it was bitterly contested. This was by no means a formal and pleasant discussion, right? So there were setbacks, rearrests, walkouts, etc. So there's a lot of movement here. In 2008, the military came up with a constitution. This was formally drafted and subjected to a referendum. Now that referendum was boycotted by the NLD and rejected by Aung San Suu Kyi. Okay, so their supporters were asked to vote, to either boycott or vote no. But not surprisingly, the referendum succeeded. So it ratified the constitution, but everyone really regarded this as fraudulent. Okay, so here we're not anywhere really, close to what we think is, anything like a democracy, right? Now, the military persisted with this constitution, and this underlay the 2012 partial elections. Okay, so there were partial elections to the parliament in 2012, about 30 seats. Now, in this election, Aung San Suu Kyi did participate. So between 2008 and 2012, she had a change of heart. Why? Well, this is exactly the same constitution. So the one that was rejected in 2008 was the one that governed the elections in 2012. The NLD participated and won most of those seats. Okay. And in fact, Aung San Suu Kyi was elected to the parliament then. Okay, so this is a tacit acceptance of a deal here. In 2015, the same constitution applied to the election, which was for the whole parliament. Again, Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD participated, and here they won a landslide victory. Okay. Now, the surprising thing is that Tamandao accepted that and left office. Okay, so they did. So she actually legitimately held power, as we all know. The first thing she did was expressed immediate dissatisfaction with the constitution and pledged to introduce constitutional reform. Okay, so what are the elements of the constitutions that are, weird by any reasonable notion of what a constitution does? The military, the Tamandao, is reserved 25% of seats in both houses, which are directly appointed by the military. In order to change the constitution, you require 75% plus one. So it's impossible to change the constitution without the military's involvement. The Tamandao directly controls 3 core ministries and the General Administration Department, which essentially determines, provides the bureaucrats, the bureaucracy. The military is fighting wars against multiple non-state armed groups, ethnic armed organizations, which, of which there are a dizzying array in Myanmar, some of which are very well armed, and these wars have been long-standing. There are different forms, and some of them are in peace, ceasefire. There are no cases where they have laid down their weapons, and they are, formidable opponents to the military. These are in areas where most of the mineral wealth of the country resides. The constitution codifies direct military control in these areas of conflict. The military is completely autonomous and appoints its own home and border affairs ministers. It can unilaterally impose martial law under Section 419, which is what's being imposed now. It gives the Commander-in-Chief authority, and this is the Commander-in-Chief of the military, authority to exercise all power to delegate it to other than elected representatives. And the military has the right to veto decisions in a light item sense. Okay, so Aung San Suu Kyi said in 2015, the completion of our democratic transition must necessarily involve the completion of a truly democratic constitution. She tabled a bill removing the army's veto in 2015, and it received a lot of support, of course, but of course it failed. And did that affect the legitimacy of the transition? It did not. This is important. The international community is playing a role here by recognizing the transition as legitimate, even though it doesn't really comply to what anyone would think is a reasonable constitution. So the bottom line is, from 2015, Aung San Suu Kyi controlled much of the state, but she could not affect any of the offices or revenue sources that directly flowed to the Tamandao. Okay, this is not unusual. Okay, this has happened in many cases. It's documented. I'm not going to get time to talk about these, but if you are interested in this, there's a fantastic book written by Albertus and Monaldo that documents many of these. Okay. So the building blocks to our explanation of what has been happening were that there were gains from the democratic transition across the board. These gains come from the expansion that comes from being no longer a pariah state. The Tamadao's problem is how to grab a share of those gains. They face a commitment problem. They started a process which will ultimately undermine their power. And they solved this in the short term by engineering a power sharing deal. So under what conditions are these deals more feasible? They're most likely to be feasible when there's the great fear of revolution. Yeah, that's okay. Can you hear me now? Yes, okay. There's a great fear of revolution. This did not apply in the case of Myanmar. When there are large gains coming from the international community, this did apply. And this is important, that we think the transition was not perceived by the elite to be so great in undermining their power. Okay, so why they wrote a constitution, why not just have an informal power sharing agreement? I'm not going to spend any time on that. I don't have time to talk about that. I'm going to talk about what can go wrong with this plan. Okay, what can go wrong is what actually went wrong. I think the key problem here is the Tamadao had to preserve their share of the influence and benefits long enough for this path to be continued on. And after 2015, the Tamadao could reasonably have anticipated that the NLD would have been quite unpopular as a government and that they would have had a significant role in future governments, either via their party or through direct input. Okay, why is this? Well, because one, Myanmar's difficult to govern. Okay, it's an amazingly heterogeneous country with many different ethnic groups and with much conflict along the periphery. Two, Aung San Suu Kyi was popular, but she was certainly untested as a leader. And I think in many ways, some of the disappointment with her as a leader has been manifest. She has been autocratic. She has been, even to her own supporters, they've criticized her for failing to repeal many of the repressive laws, to speak out about political prisoners, and for her attacks on the media. Reform has been slow and governance has been quite poor. The NLD has refrained from diminishing the military's power. Additionally, the Rohingya genocide received strong condemnation, and the Tatmadaw have really largely been the greatest economic beneficiaries of the expansion. Okay, yet, despite all this, what happened in November 2020 was that she won an even greater majority than in the 2015 elections. So more than 70% of eligible voters turned out, and the NLD won more than 80% of the vote, surprisingly high. So clearly, this capacity of the regime to threaten for power has fallen faster than anticipated. It's simply unimaginable that the level of dissent we're seeing now could have happened in 2015. So what we think happens is the Tatmadaw saw evidence that this is happening and it could fall further still. What's the evidence? Well, there's lots of it. Firstly, the level of unrest we're seeing now. Secondly, there have been an increase in desertions from the military. Many soldiers must have voted for the NLD. Just with these massive numbers, you see areas which are essentially military townships also were electing representatives from the NLD. So what happened, we think, is exactly what's happened by Matheson conjectured, is the coup was a preemptive strike. Okay, so what happened is it was a preemptive strike. How could have this been avoided? One, there are two problems, right? One is their popularity fell too fast and there's insufficient benefits to them prior to their permanent decline in power. So what could have happened, what could have been done instead was to increase their power share, right? So this is the opposite of the direction that everyone's talking about in terms of constitutional change. It was to be to give them more power, not less. Increase transfers to the Tatmadaw. Again, this is the opposite to what happened, okay? And here the international community is doing what's morally right. They're saying, look, Min Aung Hlaing was clearly involved, not just involved, orchestrated the genocide against the Rohingya. He should be punished. And they did. They froze his assets. But of course, this goes in the opposite direction of increasing benefits to the democratization. gradualizing the decline in the Tamadao's power would have been another thing they could have done. So there was already forbearance on the part of the NLD. I think precisely for this reason, they could have gone further. Okay, so what's the current situation? Now we have, and I'm just going to wrap up quickly, I know I'm nearly out of time. The current situation is the junta, the Tamadao, is essentially finding it very difficult to govern. Okay, so why? Well, there are a lot of things happening on the part of the population. There is a civil disobedience movement. There are strikes, absenteeism. There's hostility in traditional Tamadao strongholds. So in the areas where the Tamadaos never faced problems in the lower in the lowlands. There's armed, primitively armed, but armed resistance happening all over the country. Okay, the banking system's close to collapse, and government revenues have plunged, partly because the government is suffering such high rates of absenteeism. So how have they reacted? Well, they've increased repression. At the same time, there's increasing conflict with the ethnic armed organizations. A lot of this is happening in Shan State, but it's possible that it could ignite across the whole country. In addition, and this is now on the side of the population, in addition to the brutal repression that they're suffering now, there's a possible humanitarian crisis brewing. The economy is already vulnerable due to COVID, and the monsoon's coming. So the planting season prior to the monsoon has to happen, or else there could be a food shortage. A big fear for the Tamadao is that there's increased unity amongst the ethnic armed organizations. Okay, there's even talk of those organizations in the liberated areas forming a federal army and a real federation that would be comprised of EAOs initially. The EAOs are trying to expand in areas of control that were previously pretty solidly Tamadao. So what's happening is the Tamadao is getting squeezed at both ends. Okay, so here's where I'm going to be speculative and make some predictions. So what I think cannot happen is a reversion back to the 2015-2020 situation. I think we have to move on and understand that this top-down transition is over. Okay, if the Tamadao were to back down, they would simply be confirming the thing that they most fear. That is that they are unable to threaten for power. If they were to back down now and let the parliament sit, they would be forever neutered, forever, at least for the foreseeable future. So I think that's just not possible. So any sort of possibility of a diplomatic solution here, I don't see. What I think can happen, and which I think is likely, and I'll tell you why I think it's likely in a second, is a reversion to autocracy. The Tatmadaw will eventually weather the protests, they'll weather the civil dissent, the increased conflict with the EAOs will not threaten them sufficiently, and democracy will be suppressed. We'll move to something that looks like, well, prior to 2010 anyway. So what I think can also happen more optimistically, but I'm going to say unlikely, is a bottom-up transition. Okay, so here, this could happen if the ethnic armed organizations consolidate, and if they consolidate with the NLD pro-democracy movement. There's already a CRPH. This is this committee. This is essentially comprised of individuals who were elected to the parliament but are not able to take their seats after the coup. They are already circulating an alternative federal constitution, a truly federal one that would incorporate not just autonomy, but a true federation in the ethnic areas. I think this can't happen unless the Tatmadaw breaks apart. Okay, and why? Well, just the numbers. The Tatmadaw is 500,000 or so soldiers. If you add up all the EAOs, maybe they add up to a fifth of that, probably not that far. And the Tatmadaw is simply way better resourced. Okay, so I think I'm nearly out of time. On that pessimistic note, let me just say what we learned from this. We think that even when democratic transitions are beneficial for everyone, they may not be chosen by autocrats. And why? They just reasonably worry that they'll not get any share of the promised gains. And we think this is what happened in Myanmar. Here, they tried to engineer a type of power sharing that was, mandated, not mandated, sort of organized under a constitution. And the international community played an important role in conditioning the benefits on respecting the power sharing agreement. But it's not a real democracy, but it's a lot better than what we had. It's a partial democratization. It has a lot of unsatisfactory elements. They're listed here. But even with that, there are real threats to it happening. And the biggest one is a dramatic decline in the previous autocrat's power can easily derail it. And I think that's exactly what happened in the case of Myanmar, and that's where we are today. Okay, so I believe I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
So shall I take over for the
Yes.
discussion?
Yes.
Yes, I'll just share my slide, my presentation.
And for the audience, of course, you can start writing in the chat if you have questions for the question and answers that will start after Björn's discussion.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me say that it is an honor for me to be able to participate in this event and to discuss Patrick's great paper. And let me also congratulate the organizers of this initiative, the Peace Talks initiative, Quentin, Massimo, and Dominic, for setting this up, because I think this is a very useful idea, a very useful project. I would call it a public good. Trying to bridge the academic debate on foreign policy and have policymakers involved. I think that's necessary, and it's great that we have a platform now that serves for this purpose. Before I start the discussion, the substantial part of the discussion, I would like to make a couple of disclaimers up front, because I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner, I'm a diplomat, so bear with me so that I have to explain this a bit to you. So the views and opinions expressed in this intervention are those of the speaker, so my own, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the German Federal Foreign Office. The points made in this intervention are of a purely technical nature. They abstract from normative and political considerations, and they are not in any way a statement on the situation in Myanmar. And then a final disclaimer. In my discussion, I prioritize feasibility over desirability, and inconvenient observations are allowed. So you will see what I'm referring to with this in a couple of minutes. So first of all, when I first read the paper, Patrick's paper and James' paper, I thought it was really inspiring. So it's a great piece of academic work, and I have to say that I learned a lot from reading it the first time. And I had a couple of associations, observations, reflections right away when I started reading it. So I think it's a very useful, a helpful contribution to the foreign policy debate. So I'm looking forward to see it published. I think in general, there's much merit in doing research on power transitions. This is, or democratization or democratic transition is one of the most important issues in foreign policy. We have seen many high-profile cases in the last 2 decades: the color revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, the Arab Spring, Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya. Very recently, Belarus. Venezuela has been a big issue in foreign policy. Nicaragua is a similar problem, if you want. Of course, Myanmar as well is on that list. So it's basically on the list of, all these countries are on the list of conflicts that we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis as diplomats. Briefly, to top-down versus bottom-up democratization, I think, as Patrick also explained, top-down transition is probably the more peaceful way to democratize. bottom-up transitions almost inevitably involve political violence. There's one exception, that's the German Democratic Republic. I think it's at least the one that I had to think of when reading the paper, and that's, I think, a rare exception, German reunification. And then, of course, in the diplomatic community, there's a need, and I would even say a desire to better understand the logic of power transition. So you see that there's been a couple of, I would say, failed attempts to democratize. Syria, Libya, just cases in point. And I think what is more and more recognized in the diplomatic community is that there is a trade-off when we talk about power transitions. So there's a trade-off between desirability and feasibility. It's actually a dilemma. So what is desirable is often not feasible, and what is feasible is often not desirable. I think this is one of the lessons that we have learned over the last couple of decades since the fall of the Iron Curtain. So I'm now trying to get into some of the specifications of Patrick's and James's model, that where I had to think of where I had to think twice at least to understand it, or to be sure that I understand the gist of it. So when in the model, when you talk about the opposition, you talk about the opposition's commitment problem. I was wondering about its extent. So which part or which share of the executive is de facto under the opposition's control, so under the democratic control, especially in the case of Myanmar. In my experience and my observation, I would say the security sector often remains under control of the security elite. So it is usually not under democratic control. That's important. I think that's not, we will see. So the second point in the model is the opposition's odds of weakening the military after the transition. So I would say from my observation that the opposition's odds are lower than the model presumes. I think it is very hard to challenge and or weaken armed forces without an armed force. So the opposition doesn't have an armed force. The military has the armed force, a monopoly on that force, and it's not going to be challenged easily by demonstrations or public resistance on the streets. So I think that's a point that we should discuss. Now turning to the military. So the paper says the military can't influence the risk of revolution ex ante. So I would say we've seen in a lot of contexts that there is a growing tendency of institutionalizing or anti-civil society laws. Many autocratic countries are doing that all across the world. It's an autocratic contest strategy. It's part of repression. So I would say that actually the military can influence the risk of revolution. And secondly, the military's odds of retaking power after the transition. Here's another key question that I have. Are they really lower than before the transition? I would say probably not, because the government, the former opposition, doesn't have control of the armed forces and doesn't have its own armed force. Which brings me to the conclusion or the observation that control of armed forces in this type of settings is the ultimate bargaining chip. And you need to have control of armed forces in order to impose your own will, basically, political will. So the key question here is the military's transition value, the value of the point where you relinquish power, is it larger or higher than the military's coup value, or the military's point where it wants to retake power? So I was asking myself, is democracy only feasible between these two values, the transition value and the coup value of the military? And is there some kind of inverse U-shaped function? So I drew this little picture. I hope you can see it well on your screen. And it's basically an attempt to visualize the kind of process that the model describes. So here at the left, so I have two axes. On the left side, the y-axis is the net present value of the autocratic government. So what the government is actually, the military is actually trying to maximize net present value. So basically it's wealth. And then you have on the x-axis, you have the power share of the democratic government. So as we move from the beginning of the transition along the x-axis to a higher power share of the democratic government, we see a development of this graph, which is, as I talked about, the inverse U shape. So you have a point on this line where the military's value for relinquishing power is. That's here. And this is where, you know, the top-down transition starts. And then, according to the model, you know, you see an increase in NPV of the autocratic government. And then, as the model predicts, it's with, you know, with the rising power share of the democratic government, you see a decline in that NPV. That's along this line here. And at some point in time, the military wants to retake power because it's no longer advantageous to be out of power, basically. So the first question is on this line: where is the value for retaking power actually located? Should it be located on the same level as the value for relinquishing power, or should it be located on a lower level? So down here, at a later stage of the transition. So that's the first question I have. I would assume, in the case of Myanmar at least, that it's probably the same level and not a lower level, as the model presumes. But I would say, and that's an even more important observation from my perspective, that in order to have a successful transition, you know, having this kind of line, this turning downwards is bad, actually, for success of the transition. You need to have this line continue upwards, you know, a monotonous kind of function that continues to increase along the transition. So you would want to have the NPV of the autocratic government increase with the increase of the power share of the democratic government in order to not have a coup. That's inconvenient, of course, because it means that the military would get richer and richer. The NPV would increase, while you would see also democracy increase. So that's basically the military trading in power against wealth. And you can see here, that's what I call the democratic space. The democratic space is small in between those two values, if they are here. And the democratic space is really large when you look at the value of the military accepting full democracy up here. So that's basically an inconvenient trade-off. This is how I understood the model, and let's discuss afterwards. Some other points. I only have 3, 4, 5 minutes left, so I'll be quick. We should look deeper into what I call the autocratic gamble, you know, to relinquish power. Why do autocrats relinquish power? So I would say this is an investment decision. We should look at risk and return. We should use a classical kind of investment calculation, net present value, benefits, costs, and then we have to look at the discount factor. And I would say this is quite interesting. The discount factor in such a model is, I think, different you know, according to, for example, the age of the leadership, of the military leadership. You know, relatively young autocrats should have a bias towards retaking power. Relatively old autocrats should have a bias towards relinquishing power because they have a different discount factor. So next slide. So I think that's important also to look at when you look at the leadership of an autocratic government. Another observation: simultaneous exhibition, playing 2 games of chess at the same time. Also from a practitioner's perspective, what we see in many of these transitional contexts is that you actually have 2 chessboards. We are playing on 2 chessboards, the democratic chessboard and the autocratic chessboard. Usually we start at the autocratic chessboard, and then we have a democratic chessboard. In the case of Venezuela, actually it was the other way around. We had a democratic chessboard, and then we suddenly moved towards an autocratic chessboard, and then we play on both chessboards at the same time. On the democratic chessboard, you know, we have an electoral contest for power. The allocation mechanism is a vote. The actors are political parties, individuals, according to the type of democracy. On the autocratic chessboard, there's a completely different allocation mechanism. It's not vote, it's fight. So it's martial contests. The actors are army, police, armed groups, insurgent rebels. And you have to basically have both chessboards in your kind of thinking when you talk about, when you strategize about power transitions, because they're both relevant. The autocrats like to play the autocratic chessboard because they're better in that. The Democrats like to play the democratic chessboard because they're obviously better than that. But the difficulty is to move from two chessboards to one chessboard, and that's actually quite a challenge. So in most fragile states, the political game is played on both chessboards simultaneously. So we should not neglect the logic of of martial contests, as I call them. So two further observations on democracy and peace, since this is about peace talks is the motto of this event. So we see a fundamental trade-off between democratization and peace, I would say. Political violence is an ever-present danger on the path from autocracy to democracy. You have seen this in recent high-profile cases such as Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. What we had to learn, and that's also an inconvenient lesson, if the autocratic organization is in good shape, there's little room for democratization. So it basically is an optimization problem. Achieving democracy without causing political violence is hard, is extremely hard. And we don't want to, cause political violence with foreign policy. It's basically, it's an ethical imperative, avoid political violence, do no harm, etc. So I would say the vices of decision makers, foreign policy decision makers in this type of democratization discussions is impatience, for example, sanctions, or overconfidence of military decision makers, interventions. Often a consequence is fueling conflict without achieving the goal, or with even making the decision worse. That's something that we also need to discuss, I guess. The virtues, I would say, in terms of democratization and peace are strategic patience of foreign policy decision makers, prioritize negotiations, even with people even with autocrats. Prudence of military decision makers is a virtue. And I think generally we should avoid to disrupt the political process, because that's usually a recipe for political violence. Next slide, last slide, power sharing and peace. Also a couple of observations. I think the model, and that's a great strength of Patrick's and James' model, is that it applies to different types of power sharing. The hybrid power sharing that is present in Myanmar, democratic power sharing where you have grand coalitions, proportional representation, but also autocratic power sharing, which is often the case in civil war countries, after peace agreements where you have not had elections yet. So I think the model is very useful for all these types of power sharing. We should use it for that. I think what is very important to have is an idea of the quantity of the power shares. And that's, I think, a very important. Future research should look into this. What happens, according to different, distribution of power between autocratic and democratic, or between different, power sharing kind of entities. I think there's no research on this, and I think it would be, at least for my work, it would be extremely useful to have some more, quantitative evidence on what happens, when power is distributed in a different way, 20/80 versus 40/60 versus 50/50, etc. So two final points. Hypothesis, I would say you can make the hypothesis that every democracy that maintains armed forces features an implicit power sharing arrangement. And that's across the world. So that applies to fragile countries and non-fragile countries, and mature democracies and pure autocracies, and new democracies, or every type of democracy. And then an unconventional, almost crazy idea, which I got by reading the paper. The military's coup value of when it wants to retake power can and should be estimated for all countries that maintain armed forces, including mature democracies. Because I would suspect that whenever you have armed forces present, there is something like a coup value existent. In mature democracies, probably it's very small, this value. But in other country contexts, I would assume that it's quite high. So it would be interesting to see the differences between different kind of countries or contexts on what the military's coup value is quantitatively. So that's just a couple of suggestions from my side. Happy to discuss, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you very much, Björn.
Fantastic discussion. Okay, so I would like to solicit a few questions from the audience, if possible, and Content could be the moderator. Maybe I'll start with one consideration / question for both of you. So one important note by Björn has been the term inconvenient observations or inconvenient, prospects, or I don't remember the exact word. And that was the example Björn used was the fact that, at some point the inconvenient trade was, in that specific case, wealth given in exchange for concessions on the political dimensions. Now, we have, of course, other examples of such important trade-offs between, what we would like and what is feasible. Think about the FARC in Colombia, and all the other elements, all the other examples where the trade-off was between, concession of judicial free cards, even after great violations of human rights, etc., in exchange for potentially the position of arms and full democratization and politicization of the parts that were instead paramilitaries before, etc. So these are other examples. Now, I wonder whether the judiciary, therefore, is part in any way of the set of feasible alternatives to what is going on right now. Because right now, in what has been proposed and discussed in these two presentations, we have been talking about power sharing as if power is, in a sense, two-dimensional. So you have the economic and the control of political institutions. But as we know, there is also, the judiciary is an important element, because democratization has to be included. As part of the democratization is not only the voting rights and the quotas in parliaments, but also checks and balances, and how independent the judiciary should be, as the discussions about Poland and Hungary in the EU are right now. So I wonder whether the judiciary could play any role, or has played any role in the discussion about potential constitutional reforms. That's my question for both.
Yeah, can I
Yes.
attempt a response? So firstly, thank you, Björn, for your comments. I think they're very interesting. I just want to speak to the question of the judiciary first, and I think that maybe I'll elaborate a little bit more in response to Björn's comments as well, if that's okay with the organizers. So firstly, I think with respect to the judiciary, yeah, absolutely. They play a really vital role. Of course, in functioning democracies, there is a subtle balance and an interplay, and there's a contested grey area between the authority of the judiciary, the parliament, and usually the armed forces are just completely mute in that discussion, right? So we don't even think about them in established democracies. So much more action and much more interesting to think about the interaction between, say, the judiciary and the elected representatives in a consolidated democracy. In these sort of democracies, in the ones that we're talking about in Myanmar, it's just not first order important. Okay, why? Because we're talking about people coming to power. The power of the gun is direct and it's immediate, and the judges don't have guns. So I think we have to really delineate between those two cases in talking about it. I think that's where most of the action is in consolidated democracies, not in democracies that are fledgling or under transition. It's gonna maybe play a small role, but I don't think it's the first order thing. So that's the first thing I'd say about that. Second thing is, I think just to kind of swing to Bjorn's comments, he makes a good point. Right? So he makes a good point that look, we seem to be in this desirability versus feasibility space, right? So we can't have everything we want, even though we'd like to. And what we need for this to work is for the military to keep getting a larger and larger share of the gains, which is kind of morally repulsive and reprehensible, but it's sort of, maybe that's the price that we need for democracy. So my claim is that's not the case, okay? And that's not what the model's telling us exactly. Up to a point it is. At the start, the military have to get a big slice of the gains, absolutely. But that slice will decline as their power declines. Now, the point is, why will they let that happen? Well, because it's too late once their power declines. So there's this subtle trade-off between them rewarding them in return for letting their power decline. And they'll do that. They'll take that deal. As long as the power declines slowly enough, as long as if it's dramatic, they're blindsided. They can't be anticipating this decline unless it's slow enough for them to be compensated. So there is a deal here that can work for everyone. And in fact, the conclusion here is the opposite to what I think Bjorn took away here. And I just want to emphasize this part of it. His claim was that if autocratic organizations are in good shape, there's little room for these democratizations. I'd say the opposite. If autocratic organizations are in good shape, then they're confident about moving forward into these sorts of deals because they don't think they're going to be blindsided quickly. They see time and they see a rosy enough future where they're going to get the gains from this. Maybe them up to retirement, maybe their kids. His point is very well taken. Their age matters. Their conjectures about the future matter for how old they are, absolutely. But their power is actually helping us get these transitions. It does not help with bottom-up transitions. Revolutions are aided by having a dysfunctional military. Top-down transitions are aided by having a functional military who's confident enough to make this deal. And then that's why I think we see these happening, not with the personalists, but with the military autocracies. Okay. Now, I think just the final point here is, I think this is very well taken. Do the military have lower odds of taking power once they leave office? I'm going to argue strongly that it's still the case, yes. Okay. And again, let's look at Myanmar. What is happening in Myanmar today is, I think Bjorn's right, it's not going to topple the military. But this is inconceivable. The risks that they are facing now are just a world away from where they were just in 2015. They would never have had this level of public dissent. This possibility of the state failing was just zero. Okay, it could not have happened. Now it's possible. They have already, in this small period of time, handing over to a government that's been pretty ineffective, their power to threaten back is declined. Now they will win, I think. And I think his point is that you need another military to fight the military. Yes and no. No, to the extent that if the military splits, if you get fissures, then it stops being an effective force. And this is how they fall. Not from, external invasion typically. It's because there is actually legitimacy to the democratic transition. And some of the generals say, look, this is wrong. We've got to stop shooting people in the streets. They're their kids. So I think there is a possibility of military fissure that becomes enhanced when the military is seen as illegitimate when they're out of power. And that's the angle that leads to the eventual full democratization. Okay.
So you are envisioning a Myanmar Yeltsin on the top of a tank.
Yeah, I think that's the most optimistic case, right? I think that's the one. I mean, and if you look at what Myanmar has that Russia didn't, is they have, a bunch of standing armies which are direct threats to the Tatmadaw all over the periphery. Now, those armies are not coordinated, but they're coordinating much more now. And they want a federal Myanmar, right? They want real autonomy in their regions. But some of these are not armies that they could ever defeat, right? The Wa have a standing army that is large, well-financed, weaponized via China, they are simply not ever going to go away. And there's many such organizations, not as strong as the WA, but you know, these are real threats that the Myanmar military faces. Now, so the most optimistic scenario, let me sketch it, is a coordination amongst these. Then the NLD being actually organized with them, so that the elected representatives from the Burma majority and Aung San Suu Kyi working with them to undermine the military, and then the military splitting, right? So some sort of fissures. We don't understand. It's a very cohesive organization, it appears it, so it seems unlikely. But if that were to happen, then they can reasonably start to sue for peace and actually look at a real transition. That's to me the most optimistic possibility.
So if I may just also answer your question, Massimo, on the role of the judiciary in these contexts. I would concur with Patrick's conclusion that probably in most of these contexts, the judiciary doesn't play a decisive role. Probably because it's weak, it's not independent in these contexts. And that's also an important point, and you mentioned Colombia. It would probably not be prudent to use the judiciary to basically come to a different conclusion than the political process. So if you hold power and you want to sign a political deal, for example, for transition deal or a peace agreement, then you need reassurance that you won't be put in jail afterwards, that you won't be put in trial afterwards, and so you will get an amnesty, or you get some kind of light judgment or something, and the judiciary is best advised politically not to try to interfere and reverse the political deal. So in case of Colombia, the International Criminal Court never intervened. It could have intervened, it never did, for exactly that reason, because there would not have been a signature under the peace agreement if the ICC would have come with a prepared kind of document saying, okay, you have to come to The Hague afterwards. So that's in any kind of transition. It's not advisable to use the judiciary for that kind of purpose, because you won't get a deal. And yes, Patrick, we can, I think, argue about the prospects of Myanmar and transitions in general. I mean, the question, at the outset, ex ante, is why would and you have it in your paper, why would the military choose to relinquish power voluntarily if it finds itself 5 years afterwards in a situation where it needs to retake power? So there's a kind of an inconsistency, and that's why I'm saying, okay, this situation is occurring, and it's basically it's not a success. The transition is not a success because we are in a situation like the one we see now. So something went wrong, and I think that what went wrong is that the military was not compensated in the way it probably wanted to be compensated along the way of the transition. So you probably would have had to, trade that in somehow or buy it off the military, the kind of compensate the military for relinquishing more and more power to the democratic government. I think that's, for me, that's the reason why we are in a situation, are in the situation that we are in now. And I think the model, I think what we need to do is work out a way that these kind of situations don't occur. So that's why I made this suggestion, to look at, to see it like this. I'm not sure what's right or wrong, of course. But I feel we could have avoided that situation, probably, not we as the international community, but the actors in Myanmar, by being a bit more, politically savvy on this issue. That's all I'm saying. Independent of the desirability, which I think we all agree on, what is desirable and what is not desirable. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. Now we have also, for the last 15 minutes, we'll invite people from the audience to ask questions, and we have 2 already. So I would like to let Sebastiano ask his question. So let me check if I can unmute you here. Ask to unmute. Yes. You should be able to. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Sebastiano.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. Can you hear me all right?
All right.
Yeah, I want to ask a question for Mr. Francois. And I was wondering if you believed if the population in Myanmar was more homogeneous, would you think that that would make the Tamadaw more confident in their abilities to retain power? Or would it, on the other hand, delegitimize their role as the protectors of the state? So on their ability to conduct violence? And that's the question. And thank you so much for the presentation. It was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastiano. So I think actually Myanmar is a kind of an interesting case, right? In the sense that the Tamadaw is really comprised almost entirely from the Burma majority. So the sometimes called the Burmese, right? So these are the lowland dwellers, and it I think sees itself as the protector of the state. And the state there is much more Burma oriented than really accommodating of the ethnic minorities. Okay, so that's partly why the ethnic minorities have these militias and these long-standing conflicts, is to assert their claims and to be able to obtain the degree of autonomy that they have. So it has never been a true federation. It has been a Burma majority state ruled by the Tamadaw. So I don't think that they see their constituents, right, as the members of the ethnic minorities. For them, they are representative of the Burma majority. And in fact, Aung San Suu Kyi was very much like that too. I mean, part of the problem that was seen with her is that she was seen as doing too little to push the rights of the minorities in the periphery. So I actually don't think more homogeneity would change that very much. Okay, I think that's because their focus is very much the Burma majority. And I think, for instance, I mean, this is I think a sad truth, but I think it's a truth that Aung San Suu Kyi's not speaking out against the Rohingya genocide and her defense of the military's actions there in the international court was politically popular. Right, that's politically popular amongst the Burma majority. If you were an astute politician maximizing votes, that was the right thing to do, right? So that tells you something about the relationship between the Burma majority and the periphery of the country. Now, the Rohingya are particularly poorly considered by that majority, so maybe that doesn't apply to all ethnic groups, but that's the reality of the politics there, I think. So I think, can I just comment briefly on Björn's point, which I think is a very good one. I think the military did not anticipate that they would be taking power again in 5 years' time. That was not the plan. That was a failure, right? And that's a failure that's anticipated. It could happen, but they didn't think it was likely. What they thought was their power would decline slowly, that they would have an important role even in, parliamentary politics. And what they saw in this intervening 5-year period is that they are immensely unpopular amongst the Burma majority. They would never be able to threaten for power through normal political means. So they were going to be expropriated further. They were anticipating a number of years, 10, 20, like Chile, where they would retire with immense wealth and not be prosecuted. And that they see now is unlikely to transpire. So then they are threatened for power. So this is a mistake. If they had known this was going to happen in 2015, they would not have gone down this path. It was a possibility that it could have worked out better, that if they were more politically popular, if there were more resources that they could be bought off with, we would be still on this democratic path. So I think there are lessons here about what the international community can do, but we can talk about them.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Now I'll invite Stefano to actually ask two questions or one question for the speakers.
Okay, thank you very much. I really like to thank you, both Professor Francois and Dr. Gehrmann, for the very interesting and to the point analysis. I really appreciated the discussion today. Just very briefly, I've been working on Myanmar since 2014, and actually I've been co-authoring an article about the top-down transition of Myanmar as a form of autocratic resilience. So I feel very much engaged with this topic. And I have a question. I would like to make many questions actually, but I will stick just to the first two that came to mind that are directly related to the topics we discussed today. The first one would be for Professor Francois, and is about the scenarios, because I tend to agree on the analysis there on, you know, which scenario is the more likely, which one is the more unlikely, and which one is not going to happen. But I would like to have a clarification about that. And then specifically about, I completely agree on the fact that Tatmadaw doesn't want to get back to the 2015-2020 form of governance of the country. I think in that case, Myanmar was not experiencing real democracy, obviously. It was some sort of hybrid regime, but it was a kind of hybrid regime we could call, Diamond would call basically competitive authoritarianism. So I'm wondering if in their willingness to get back to some sort of, let's say, more autocratic regime, what they're thinking about. If it is about getting back to full-fledged autocracy, closed autocracy, you know, like the kind of military dictatorship that was used in the country before 1962-2010, or rather maybe some sort of hegemonic electoral authoritarianism, maybe something where they have election, but at the same time, the government is not going to change and they're able to stay in power directly, or let's say indirectly, by their proxy party, the USDP, or whatever other kind of political emanation they're going to create again in the future. Because personally thinking, I mean, I think that if provided with the choice, they will go for the second option. I think that will maximize the returns for them and minimize the risks. But of course, it depends if the option is going to be on the table, which in turn depends on the amount of opposition they're going to face internationally and more importantly at the internal level. So I would appreciate your insight about this. About my second question to Dr. Gehrmann, it is about the Tatmadaw and the role of the Tatmadaw in this situation, because I sort of agree on the pessimism that Dr. Gehrmann shared in his discussion of the situation. And but I also think, and this was touched in the discussion, that the greatest risk for the Tatmadaw and for the capacity of the Tatmadaw to hold up, it is about the fact that some internal split in the Tatmadaw happens or not. So I've been wondering, because this is being discussed at the time, but I don't see any kind of sign about any kind of internal cleavage in the Tatmadaw today. The rate of desertion has been very low. And I think also the kind of purges that Tatmadaw went through directly and indirectly, also up to 2015, somehow managed to keep the organization cohesive. So my question there is basically, there's any actual chance for the Tatmadaw to break out and give room to an actual democratization? Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you very much to both.
Thank you, Stefano. So yeah, you can start, Patrick, then Björn will answer, and it's already 5:26. So if you manage to fit your both answers in the time remaining.
Firstly, yes, thank you. So Stefano, thank you for the question, and I'd really like to see your paper, so please send that to me. Yes, I think you've thought about this more than me, right? So I think everything you said there makes sense to me. They would prefer electoral authoritarianism. The way that they're talking now suggests that that's what they're going to try to engineer. I think what will happen will depend on the role of the international community. So how much they will reward window dressing type electoral authoritarianism relative to, reversion back to prior to 2010. So I think the international community will play a role there. I don't know what the incentives are for the international community to legitimize electoral authoritarianism. I don't think there's a lot of point to it, actually. That would clearly, it helps the autocrats stay in power. It's a pressure valve. It helps them get information. There's a lot of theories about why these things exist. I think that's what they're trying to engineer. Yes, I agree. The IC is going to play an important role here.
Thank you. Björn, if you want to answer.
Yes, thank you, Stefano, for the question. So I'm not a real expert on Myanmar, so I don't want to make any kind of I don't want to speculate about fissures in the Tatmadaw, because I'm not an expert on the Tatmadaw, etc. But I think in general, what I said, if an autocratic organization is in good shape, it's hard, to deal with it. So of course, then the idea would be to see to it that to change the shape of the organization, which basically means, in my understanding, you need to create outside options for members of the organizations which are attractive. And I think that's probably the best strategy to pursue in these type of contexts. Create outside options for members of this huge organization, or of these huge organizations, which militaries are sometimes, and that's something for the long haul, I would say, and not something that you can achieve overnight. That's why I say strategic patience is probably the way to go in these contexts, and we should not try to disrupt anything prematurely, or take too many risks also as international community in these contexts, because it can backfire. As I said, political violence is often, as we see in Myanmar, is often the result of these, or it's, let's say, a symptom of the problem that occurs quite frequently across contexts.
Thank you very much, John and Stefano, clearly, for your questions and your participation. Now it's already nearly the end, so before closing, I would like just to turn one last time to Massimo and Dominique if they want to add something or add the last questions or comments to the speaker.
Yeah, so thanks, Gonta. So there's one question I was just wondering, but maybe it's better not to ask it to Björn, because he may get into trouble with his hierarchy. But like maybe Patrick, who's so if you were the international community, if you were Joe Biden, or if you were von der Leyen, what would you do? Would you what would be kind of the actions if we want to kind of champion the small unlikely case of the optimistic scenario of Patrick? So what would be the best options we can all do in Western democracies? I mean, Björn, of course, you can also answer, but maybe you prefer not.
Yeah. So the CIA wrote this playbook, right? So it's the CIA handbook here, right? So let's just talk about what they would do. So what they would do is they would identify, exactly as Björn's saying, elements in the military, maybe ambitious soldiers, right, who they can work with, and they would try to foment dissent and fissure within the military, right? Because I think that there will not be a true democratization in Myanmar, given the current military administration, given that the transition failed along this top-down path, without the dissolution of the military, without it falling into bits, right? So that's what the CIA used to do, right? They create civil wars. Now, the cost of that is immense. The cost of that is immense. So what are the other options? I think the possibility of a negotiated solution where the military would simply revert back to the barracks and they get a little bit more, that's off the table now. And the reason is, I mean, this comes directly from our analysis, that would be showing that they are not able to threaten for power, that they take a compromise deal which puts Aung San Suu Kyi back in power, then it's over for them. They're not going to do that. So that peaceful path is simply not there. So now you start thinking about, well, what would be, and then here we just face, there's no magic bullets here. Here we face the usual trade-off, right? So what happens when you make the state a pariah state? You destroy all possibilities of trade. You remove official development aid. Then you penalize the people, right? The people suffer mostly. The military are probably going to be fine. They're not as well off as they were before. And you hope that that's going to pressure them to come back to the table at a future time, right? Alternatively, you take the pressure off the military, you let it stay open, you let it keep trading, you let the military businesses do well. The people will be slightly better off then, but there's no chance of democratization that way. So we're in this awful trade-off situation. There's no simple answer here now, right? So this is why it's a difficult problem. This is why the whole world's not a democracy, right? So it's difficult. But I think the role of the international community has to balance those two considerations. Like, sanctions are costly to the populace mostly, but they do undermine the military. That's what brought them to the table in the first place. But it's a trade-off. It's tough.
Thank you.
Very good. I'd like to conclude by thanking all participants, including the questions from those who are asked important questions from the audience. I hope even the future Peace Talks meeting will reach this level of depth in such important issues, and hopefully the goal is not to take the role of Biden's, but but to stimulate this bottom-up discussion at least. Of course, we don't want to necessarily stimulate the bottom-up violence of the civil war, but what we want is to stimulate the bottom-up discussion about what can we do from outside. I'll finish here. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you. Let me just share
Thanks so much.
the slides for
Björn.
the next. So the plan for what's coming. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for this fascinating talk. And here, as Björn said, as Massimo said in the introduction, we're really trying to achieve something. And we need everyone to participate, to spread the invitation, the words, share the content, and really to aim to link better those two worlds that fail or do not talk enough together, the policy, the field expert, the real world, if you want, with academia. And I think we will all definitely benefit massively by exchanging more. So I invite you to share this content, and everything will be available on our YouTube channel in the near future. And as you can see now with the slide, we have a very exciting program in the next few months. So we're aiming at one peace talk every month, and next time reconciliation with Andrila and Pierre Azan. Social media and hate crimes, epidemics and conflict, the relevance of fragility measures. So really always concrete questions with linking policy and the world of academia. So that being said, again, thank you everyone for your participation. I wish you a wonderful weekend and hope to see many of you with your colleague in the future.